I wanted to ask you a few questions about why did you decide to write about that subject?
Queen Camilla had survived scandal, hostility, public rejection, and decades of suspicion, but nothing prepared her for the message delivered behind palace doors that morning. There was no ceremony, no warning, and no opportunity to negotiate. The Privy Council had reached a decision affecting the final royal privileges still attached to her position, and by the time Camilla understood exactly what had been removed, the decision was already beyond her power to reverse. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla held the sealed notification before breaking it open. The Privy Council, the body that records and advises on constitutional decisions for the sovereign, had been discussing her position for weeks without her presence. The language was precise. Her remaining independent access to restricted royal residences, confidential crown briefings, protected royal archives, and certain ceremonial privileges was revoked unless Charles authorized it. The Queen read the first page standing. By the final clause, she lowered herself into a chair. Charles entered moments later and understood that she had reached the part he feared most. Camilla did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him and asked whether he had known this was coming. The king hesitated. That silence struck harder than denial. She had expected enemies outside the palace. She had learned to survive headlines, whispers, and resentment. What she had not expected was to discover that the machinery closest to the crown had been moving around her while her husband remained aware of it. Camilla returned to the document and found the phrase that appeared repeatedly: preservation of constitutional separation. The crown, in this context, meant the sovereign's official authority and the powers attached to the monarchy itself, not merely the royal family as people. The wording made the danger clear. Someone believed her personal position had become too entangled with authority reserved for Charles alone. Worse, the council did not point to one mistake. It cited months of concerns about access, boundaries, and who could act without direct approval. Charles moved closer, but the distance between them suddenly felt larger. Camilla asked who had first raised the concern. He refused to answer. Then her eyes moved across the attached briefing schedule, and one name stopped her cold: William. The prince had been present at a constitutional review tied to the same access questions. In that instant, humiliation turned into suspicion, and once Camilla understood that this was not simply a council decision, but a family fracture hidden inside constitutional language, the question changed completely. Who had wanted her powers removed badly enough to begin the process? Behind the language of privilege and protocol were three people trapped inside a deeply personal collision. Camilla saw humiliation. Charles saw danger to the stability he had spent years protecting. William saw something else entirely, a boundary that, in his mind, should never have been crossed. What appeared outside palace walls to be an institutional reshuffling was becoming something far more volatile inside them, a confrontation between marriage, inheritance, loyalty, and the future of the crown. Camilla had spent years believing endurance would eventually become acceptance. She had stood beside Charles through difficult anniversaries, public criticism, and the slow rebuilding of trust. To her, service was supposed to prove something. It was supposed to show that she belonged not only beside the king, but inside the structure that supported him. A consort, meaning the spouse of a reigning monarch without the sovereign's constitutional powers, could hold enormous influence without possessing the crown itself. That distinction now felt painfully exposed. William carried a different burden. As heir, he believed anything touching restricted records, secure residences, or succession-sensitive briefings had to remain clearly separated from personal loyalty. The prince was not thinking only about Camilla, he was thinking about precedent. If private access blurred today, it could become expectation tomorrow, and the future king believed that was exactly how boundaries disappeared without anyone noticing. Charles sat alone with the council papers and removed his glasses before finishing the final pages. He knew what every option would cost. If the king pushed too hard to protect Camilla, critics inside the institution could accuse him of placing his marriage above constitutional caution. If he accepted the restrictions without protest, the woman beside him would feel abandoned. He read the same paragraph twice, then left the papers untouched for several minutes. Camilla later told Charles what hurt most. She said losing access while keeping the title felt worse than an open dismissal. The Queen could still smile beside him, attend engagements, and stand before cameras, yet behind closed doors, she would now need permission where none had been required before. Charles tried to explain the distinction, but she cut him off. To her, the message was simple: trusted in public, questioned in private. William had started the chain months earlier with a written request to constitutional advisors. He asked which privileges belonged strictly to the sovereign, which belonged to the heir, and which could legally extend to a consort. The prince had not demanded Camilla's removal, he had demanded clarity. But that clarity exposed a web of permissions broader than anyone expected, and Charles learned the council considered some of them dangerously loose. One permission stood apart from all the others: Camilla's access to a restricted royal archive during a private Windsor review. That visit would become the point everyone looked back on. Because the council had not awakened one morning and suddenly turned against Camilla. The fuse had been lit earlier, during one quiet Windsor encounter that transformed suspicion into action. Behind the language of privilege and protocol were three people trapped inside a deeply personal collision. Camilla saw humiliation. Charles saw danger to the stability he had spent years protecting. William saw something else entirely. A boundary that, in his mind, should never have been crossed. What appeared outside palace walls to be an institutional reshuffling was becoming something far more volatile inside them. A confrontation between marriage, inheritance, loyalty, and the future of the crown. Camilla had spent years believing endurance would eventually become trust. She had stood beside Charles through criticism and the slow rebuilding of acceptance. To her, service had proved she belonged inside the royal structure, not merely beside the king. A consort, meaning the spouse of a reigning monarch without the sovereign's constitutional powers, could still hold influence and access. Now that distinction felt brutally personal. William saw the issue differently. As heir, the person next in line to the throne, he believed restricted crown records, secure residences, and succession-sensitive briefings had to remain separate from family affection. The prince was thinking beyond Camilla. He was thinking about precedent, and what future generations might inherit if private permissions became permanent expectations. Charles sat alone with the council papers and removed his glasses before reaching the final page. He knew every choice carried a cost. If the king defended Camilla too aggressively, advisors could see a husband protecting his wife above caution. If he accepted the restrictions quietly, she would feel abandoned by the person whose loyalty mattered most. He read the passage twice, then set the papers down. Camilla later spoke to Charles in private. Her voice stayed controlled, but the hurt underneath it was unmistakable. She told him that keeping the title while losing independent access felt worse than dismissal. The Queen could still attend engagements and stand beside him publicly, yet behind closed doors, she would now need permission where none had been required before. To her, the message was simple: trusted before cameras, distrusted once the doors shut. William had quietly started the process months earlier by asking palace constitutional advisors for a written definition of which privileges belonged to the sovereign, which belonged to the heir, and which could extend to a consort. He had not requested Camilla's removal, he had requested clarity. But that clarification exposed permissions broader than expected, and Charles learned the council considered some dangerously loose. One permission stood apart: Camilla's access to a restricted royal archive during a private Windsor review. That visit would become the moment everyone later identified as the beginning of the end. Because the council had not awakened one morning and suddenly turned against Camilla, the fuse had been lit earlier, during one quiet Windsor encounter that transformed suspicion into action. Every palace crisis has a moment that looks insignificant until history turns around and points directly back at it. In this story, that moment happened at Windsor. No shouting, no public embarrassment, no dramatic announcement. Just one unexpected encounter in a restricted corridor, one question Camilla could not answer quickly enough, And one decision William made before the evening was over. Months later, council members would still refer to it privately as the incident that made intervention unavoidable. Camilla entered the Windsor Archive Review, believing she had every right to be there. The review was an internal inventory of historical correspondence and protected crown material, including records tied to former monarchs, heirs, private estates, and constitutional exchanges. Access was tightly controlled, because even an innocent reading of such material could expose family matters or sensitive royal decisions. The Queen had previously been granted limited entry through standing household authorization connected to her role beside Charles, and she believed that permission remained valid. William arrived unexpectedly and immediately sensed something was wrong, without warning or invitation. He found Camilla speaking with an archivist inside a restricted records room about correspondence linked to earlier royal households. The prince did not raise his voice. He asked one question: who had authorized her presence that day? She answered that her existing clearance covered the visit. He then asked whether Charles or the keeper of the royal archives had personally renewed that permission. Camilla hesitated. That hesitation changed everything. William did not accuse her of removing papers, hiding information, or acting dishonestly. His concern was narrower and more dangerous. The keeper of the royal archives, the official responsible for protecting and controlling access to sensitive royal records, had not issued fresh approval. Neither had Charles. The future king became visibly colder as he realized that an old household permission had been treated as continuing authority inside a restricted environment. That evening, William requested a complete access audit. He wanted every independent privilege attached to Camilla's household examined, not only archive entry. The review uncovered permissions added gradually over years: residence access, briefing access, archival clearance, and ceremonial discretion. Each privilege looked minor alone. Together, advisors concluded they created an unusually broad sphere of independent reach for someone who was neither sovereign nor heir. Camilla learned who had started the review before the council reached its final decision. Her disbelief hardened into anger. She no longer wanted explanations passed through advisors or softened by Charles. She wanted William himself. The constitutional argument had begun on paper, but it would not remain there, because Camilla wanted William to look her in the eye and explain why he had set the machinery in motion. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. That made it worse. Camilla entered expecting anger she could fight, but William gave her something harder to break through: calm certainty. Charles stood nearby, already sensing that whatever happened next could permanently alter the balance inside his family. Then Camilla asked the question that had been building for weeks. Had William deliberately tried to have her authority taken away? The prince's answer changed the entire argument. Charles had arranged the meeting at Clarence House because he feared the dispute was becoming something far more dangerous than a constitutional disagreement. Clarence House, one of the royal residences used by senior members of the family, became neutral ground for a conversation he hoped would remain private. No large circle of advisors was allowed inside. The king wanted honesty, but he also knew honesty could split the room apart. Camilla faced William with wounded pride already hardened into suspicion. She believed legal language had been used to disguise a personal rejection, and the silence around the review had made that belief stronger. The prince saw the matter differently. To him, the argument was about limits. What authority belonged to Charles now, what might belong to him one day, and what should never pass automatically through marriage. Camilla finally asked him, "Did you want this?" William paused and placed both hands on the back of an empty chair before answering. He said he wanted the boundaries clarified, not her humiliated. The future king did not retreat from the decision to request the review, but he refused to accept that he had demanded her removal. She listened, then struck at the wound neither of them wanted named. She accused him of never truly separating her from the pain surrounding Diana. William refused to follow her there. He told Camilla that whatever grief existed between them, the question before the family was larger than memory. The prince insisted that authority belonging to the present sovereign and the future sovereign could not become blurred simply because relationships were complicated. Then William revealed what Camilla had not known. The Access Review had produced recommendations more severe than anything he requested. Several council members had independently concluded that her remaining privileges should require direct sovereign approval. The prince had opened the door, but he had not written the final judgment. Charles could no longer remain silent. He admitted that he had received an early warning about the recommendation and had not told Camilla immediately because he believed he could soften it before the final vote. The king expected anger. What he saw instead was something colder. Camilla turned away from William and looked directly at her husband. William had triggered the examination, but he had not controlled its outcome, and now Camilla's attention moved toward the one man who might have stopped the humiliation before it became final. Camilla had always believed there was one final protection no committee could overcome: Charles himself. He was her husband. He was the king. Surely that had to matter. Yet the documents before him created a brutal distinction between personal loyalty and royal responsibility. Charles could object. He could question. He could delay certain details. But if he overturned every safeguard simply to protect his wife, he risked proving the very concern the council had raised. Charles sat alone, with the final recommendation spread across his desk, reading slowly through language that left almost no room for escape. The council's ruling concerned operational privileges, the practical permissions, allowing access to restricted archives, confidential constitutional briefings, and protected areas of royal residences. Not Camilla's marriage, title, or public standing. She would remain queen consort. She would still appear beside him. But beyond ceremonial duties, her independent reach would narrow sharply. An aide entered quietly and asked whether the legal advisors should be recalled. Charles stared at the final page for several seconds, then set down his pen. "No, I understand it." The king knew exactly what the recommendation meant. The council believed access should follow official function, not simply closeness to the sovereign. If he erased those boundaries because Camilla was his wife, he could make the institution look weaker, precisely when it was trying to appear disciplined. Charles felt trapped by the cruelty of both choices. Defend her too fiercely, and he risked making the crown appear shaped by personal loyalty. Accept the restrictions, and Camilla would experience the decision as abandonment. The monarch had protected her publicly for years, but now, protection itself had become politically dangerous. Then the voting record reached him. The margin was stronger than he expected. Several members who had once supported broad household privileges now backed tighter controls after the audit exposed unclear lines of accountability. The king realized this was no temporary rebellion he could quietly reverse. Charles did manage to preserve one protection. Camilla would retain full ceremonial standing beside him because the dispute concerned institutional access, not public rank. The council accepted that distinction, but he knew it would offer little comfort. A title could remain intact while the power surrounding it disappeared. By the following morning, the decision had already become practical. Security lists were rewritten. Briefings vanished from Camilla's schedule. Permissions that once operated automatically now required direct approval. Camilla had not yet seen the revised lists, but Charles knew the first denied doorway would hurt more than anything written in the ruling. The argument had been about constitutional boundaries until then. The next morning, those boundaries acquired locks, lists, cancelled briefings, and consequences Camilla could physically feel. The real impact did not arrive with another dramatic meeting. It arrived quietly. A briefing vanished from Camilla's schedule. A security officer waited beside a doorway where no one had waited before. An aide used the phrase, "new authorization procedure," and immediately looked uncomfortable. For Camilla, that was when the council's decision stopped being language on paper. The palace around her had not changed, but her freedom inside it had. Camilla read the revised morning schedule twice before asking why a constitutional briefing had disappeared. The answer came carefully. Restricted crown briefings involving succession-sensitive material, protected archives, or matters tied directly to sovereign authority now required separate approval before she could attend. The Queen still had access when performing official duties, but independent entry had been withdrawn. On paper, it was procedure. To her, it felt like trust being measured one doorway at a time. Camilla reached one of those doorways later at Windsor. She had crossed it before without hesitation, but this time a security officer stepped forward and politely asked whether authorization had been issued. The Queen stopped. For several seconds, she said nothing. No argument came. No demand followed. She simply turned away. That silence carried more humiliation than any public rebuke could have done. Charles found her later and knew immediately what had happened. Camilla told him she could endure criticism from strangers because strangers had judged her for years. What she could not endure was being made to feel like a visitor inside the institution she had spent so long serving. The king tried to explain that the restrictions were procedural, not personal. She answered that procedures become personal when they decide where you are allowed to stand. Then the deeper reality emerged. Household staff learned that the council had ordered every legacy permission reviewed, meaning old authorizations would not quietly return once attention faded. The change was designed to last. Camilla understood then that this was not a temporary embarrassment waiting for calmer headlines. It was a new structure. William heard about the doorway incident through his household and reacted differently than some expected. The prince privately instructed staff not to celebrate, joke about, or discuss the ruling as a victory. He still believed the boundary was necessary, but he was disturbed by what the decision had become for Camilla as a human being. That restraint opened a door no protocol could create. William asked Camilla for a private conversation. No Charles, no advisors, no council papers between them. For the first time since the crisis began, the next conversation would contain no constitutional language to hide behind. Only William, Camilla, and everything neither had managed to say. By the time William entered the room, neither of them had anything left to win. The council had ruled. The restrictions were already active. Charles was not present to mediate, and no advisor waited nearby to translate emotion into careful constitutional phrases. For once, William and Camilla faced each other simply as two people whose lives had been bound together by history they had never fully escaped. What followed did not reverse the decision, but it changed what the decision meant. William had requested the meeting because he could not accept one final image of the crisis. Camilla, believing he had deliberately engineered her destruction. The prince still believed the restrictions were necessary, but necessity did not erase consequence. Camilla agreed to meet because anger had burned itself down into exhaustion. She knew another argument would not restore the privileges. The question now was whether anything human could survive beneath the constitutional damage. William spoke first. He told Camilla plainly that he still believed the boundaries were correct. Then silence settled between them. After several long seconds, the future king admitted something harder. He regretted allowing the process to reach her without warning. The words did not undo the ruling, but they stripped away some of the coldness surrounding it. He had wanted clarity. He had not wanted humiliation. Camilla answered with the truth she had avoided saying aloud. Losing archive access had hurt. Losing confidential briefings had hurt. But neither was her deepest fear. What frightened her was the possibility that after all those years inside the family, William still saw her as someone from whom the crown needed protection. The Queen did not accuse him. That made the confession heavier. William did not retreat from his position. He explained that the same standard would apply to anyone married to a sovereign, even someone closest to himself in the future. The crown, meaning the continuing authority of the monarchy beyond any one marriage or generation, had to outlive every personal relationship. The prince said that affection could influence people, but it could not be allowed to define constitutional access. Camilla stopped fighting for reversal in that moment. Instead, she asked for one promise. She wanted her public service protected from deliberate humiliation. No reduced role for spectacle. No ceremonial shrinking, designed to make the ruling look harsher than it was. William agreed. That agreement gave Charles something he had not possessed before: a path forward. The king could not restore what had been removed, but he could shape what came next. The rights were gone, but the war around them was ending, and what happened next would determine whether the public saw a queen cast aside or a monarchy deliberately redrawing its boundaries. Palaces can contain secrets for years, but they cannot always contain consequences. Once changes to Camilla's access became visible, speculation exploded beyond the gates. Commentators searched old engagements for clues. Newspapers treated every expression like evidence. Yet one public moment transformed the story from palace intrigue into national conversation. It happened outside Buckingham Palace, where a small crowd gathered beneath headlines announcing that the Queen's private royal privileges had been sharply curtailed. Charles watched the coverage with growing frustration. The palace had issued a tightly controlled statement saying internal access procedures had been updated while Camilla's public role and ceremonial standing remained unchanged. Ceremonial standing, meaning the official position a royal holds at public events and state occasions, was important because the decision had not removed her title or her place beside the king. Yet the headlines made the distinction almost disappear. Camilla heard broadcasters divide the story into two competing meanings. Some described the change as a humiliating personal demotion. Others framed it as a constitutional clarification, separating a consort's role from authority belonging to the sovereign. The Queen understood why the debate mattered. If the public saw her as cast out, years of service could suddenly be rewritten as failure. If the decision looked procedural, she could still preserve dignity without pretending nothing had changed. Charles became visibly angry when one report suggested Camilla had effectively been expelled from royal life. The king instructed aides to correct that impression immediately, but he refused to deny the real restrictions. He knew exaggeration could damage her, yet false reassurance could damage the crown. For once, protecting both required the same thing, admitting the limits while refusing the humiliation. Camilla then made her own decision. She would not cancel her next engagement. She told her household that disappearing would allow the ruling to define her more completely than any council vote ever could. The Queen would go out, continue working, and force the public to see that loss of access was not the same as disappearance. Then came the image that captured the entire crisis. A fictional morning newspaper appeared beneath the stark headline, "Queen's Powers Curbed," while cameras outside Buckingham Palace recorded supporters and critics arguing beside the gates. That single moment turned private constitutional language into public spectacle. Charles arrived beside Camilla at her next engagement rather than separately. Later, William joined them at a scheduled royal appearance. The prince's presence sent its own message. Restriction had not become exile, and disagreement had not become banishment. And when the cameras finally moved on, Camilla was left with the only verdict that truly mattered: whether losing power would also mean losing her place. In the end, there was no dramatic reversal. No midnight intervention restored Camilla's former privileges. No council member withdrew the ruling. And Charles did not use the crown to erase a decision designed to protect the crown itself. That was the painful finality of the moment. Camilla lost real institutional freedom. William accepted responsibility for beginning the review. Charles accepted that love could not override every boundary. And the monarchy emerged altered, but not shattered. Camilla understood the final ruling before anyone needed to explain it again. Her independent access to restricted crown archives, confidential constitutional briefings, protected residence areas, and discretionary privileges remained revoked unless Charles personally authorized them. The sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch who holds constitutional authority, could still grant access when necessary. But the Queen could no longer assume those permissions, simply because she stood beside him. Days later, Camilla prepared for an official engagement when an aide quietly mentioned the revised briefing procedure. She did not argue. She closed the folder, nodded once, and asked what time the car would leave. That small response revealed the change more clearly than anger ever could. Her title remained. Her charitable work continued. Her ceremonial precedence remained intact. The council had narrowed authority, not erased her place in royal life. Charles knew he could not restore everything his wife had lost without reopening the very conflict that had damaged them. So the king chose something different: visible loyalty. He appeared beside Camilla without pretending the dispute had never happened. He could not give her back unrestricted institutional freedom, but he could make clear that restriction was not rejection. William emerged from the crisis neither as Camilla's destroyer nor her rescuer. The prince had demanded clearer boundaries, and that demand helped set the review in motion. Yet his private conversation with her prevented constitutional disagreement from becoming permanent family warfare. He accepted the human cost without abandoning the principle. Camilla finally accepted the hardest truth of all. Proximity to the sovereign could bring influence, affection, prestige, and enormous public standing, but it could never become ownership of sovereign power. That distinction had wounded her deeply. It also gave the crisis its final meaning. The loss, therefore, became more than punishment. It became a boundary Camilla could resent, accept, and ultimately live within, without surrendering dignity. And that became the lasting meaning of the crisis. Camilla kept her place beside the king, but the crown drew a line around its power. And this time, everyone inside the palace understood exactly where that line stood. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.